So what exactly is God's will, and why are we so obsessed with it to a point that we're afraid to not be in His will? Hello, good people. This is Joanna with the Harmonious.Balance channel. And you know, if there is one thing that can throw me off balance or off kilter, it's when life makes me question my faith. So today, I want to talk with you about one of my faith struggles, understanding God's will. Growing up, I would hear older people say, Lord willing, usually when speaking about something in the future. Lord willing, I'll see y'all next year. I'd like to do such and such, Lord willing. Going into adulthood, I started to hear people qualify their prayers. Lord, if it be your will. Now, more and more, I hear people say they want to live out God's will for their lives. They want to be aligned with God's will. When there is a loss, we often say that loss was God's will. So what exactly is God's will, and why are we so obsessed with it to a point that we're afraid to not be in His will? I pose this question because, as I stated in the first video for my faith struggles, how do you experience God? That things were feeling so high stakes that if I didn't really shift my thinking, I would live in steady state fear that I would be missing God, that I would be out of His will for my life. And I think that many of us are on this quest out of the fear of not being in His will. And doing anything out of fear messes us up, even if we're going after the right things. So why does God's will seem so hard to define or ascertain? What makes it so confusing? Because God's will shouldn't be so confusing and hard to define. Now, at my core, I don't believe God's will is complicated because I don't believe God is complicated. To me, one of the reasons I think it comes across as so complicated is we actually ascribe too much to it. We ascribe our victory, our advancement, our defeat, our intransigence, our grief, our suffering. We chalk all that up to God's will. Now, how is God's will responsible for all of that? What role do we play in manifesting His will? Let me try to approach this conversation in an organized way. I'm going to do my best not to ramble, but hang in there with me. I think that perhaps the root of the struggle is associating God's will with outcomes, when perhaps it's not outcome-based at all. For example, tragedy and loss. This is essentially associated with our belief in the sovereignty of God. He is always in control. If He does not intervene and a tragedy or loss occurs, that means He allowed it, and we deduce from there that it was God's will. I struggle with this because I'm left asking what situations warrant His intervention. To me, it seems that it would be all of them. Yet we know it's not all of them. So who gets blessed with His intervention? How am I supposed to believe that God loves and cares for me when He doesn't intervene for me, but He does for somebody else? To what extent is God really an interventionist? I'll come back to that. Another example, open and closed doors. We often pray for God to open up the doors we need to walk through and close the doors that need to be closed. Now, I think that's an honorable prayer, but is this truly an indicator of God's will? When is a door truly closed and we have to go in a completely different direction versus facing closed door after closed door, but in fact, we actually need to persist until a door opens? Those situations can actually be hard to delineate. Now, on the open door front, we've probably all taken up opportunities that we thought were open doors only to find out that we ain't had no business being there. So where does that leave us? When things are easy versus hard fought, or what we call being in the flow. A lot of time we think God's will means we operate with ease. But we all know that God's will involves uncomfortable situations and hard fought victories. In relationships, we want to be with people that we just click with. It should feel easy to be in a relationship with that person. At the same time, there could be two people who really shouldn't have gotten married, but both decide to honor their vows. So can something start out as not God's will, but then turn into God's will? Success. A huge outcome-based idea of God's will is success. Now, success is indeed relative from person to person, but we often think of success in terms of influence, financial reward, and having love. Is that the metric of God's will? Because you know, ill-gotten and ego-driven gains can bring about some of the same things. Is that God's will too? And lastly, a specific plan. Many of us are on this quest to be in God's will, meaning that they are tapped into his specific individual plan for them. Now, I'm becoming less and less inclined to believe that there is a specific plan, as in a blueprint for how each of our lives should go. And I say this because I actually think this specificity brings about an angst that we have to get this thing just right, that there's no room for error. Also, I think it's born out of an insecurity to feel special. But again, I'll come back to that. So I just said a mouthful. So I think I'm going to press pause. But I'm not going to leave those ideas floating out there without any real anchors. I'm going to come back with a part 2 to tighten up those 5 loose ends.